The sky tore, not with fire or sound, but like fabric pulled too tight. A thin wound opened above the industrial wasteland of Caronve, bleeding darkness into darkness. No one looked up. The hive moon had no sun to mark such violations. Only the eternal night of orbit, the rust-orange glow of forge fires, and the skeletal fingers of refinery towers reaching toward nothing. Ryu Hayabusa fell through the wound. He twisted once in free fall, oriented by instinct rather than sight. The drop lasted 3 heartbeats. His boots met cracked steel with a sound like snapping bone. The platform beneath him groaned, but held. Industrial debris shattered piping coils of rotted cable pools of oil thick as tar surrounded the impact point in concentric rings. He straightened, checked his pulse, checked the sword across his back, checked his breathing. The air tasted wrong, chemical, stale, like something had been burning for centuries and never fully died. Wind carried voices from the direction of the forge district. Not speech. Something rhythmic, unified. Thousands of throats making the same sounds like monks chanting in a temple buried under 10,000 tons of rust. But beneath the chanting, Ryu heard something else. A gap. An emptiness that made the ear invent sounds to fill it. He moved toward the source. The platform connected to a network of catwalks, suspended over a chasm of industrial waste. Below, in the hive's deeper levels, machinery groaned and coughed. Steam rose in intermittent bursts. Somewhere distant, an alarm wailed 3 times and stopped, as if it had exhausted itself, trying to warn people who had stopped listening generations ago. Ryu's footsteps made no sound on the metal grating. The catwalk led to a structure half collapsed against the side of a larger building. Stone pillars jutted from heaps of scrap metal. A tiled roof sagged under the weight of industrial detritus. Someone had tried to build a shrine here once. The statues were broken now, their faces worn smooth by acidic rain. Prayer flags hung in strips stained black by oil and time. Ryu stepped through the broken archway. Inside the shrine's floor was cracked tile smeared with decades of grime. A central altar had been crushed by fallen machinery. Candles sat in rusted holders, their wax long melted into the floor. The ceiling was mostly gone, exposing corroded beams and tangles of wiring that looked more like dead vines than technology. He found a strip of black cloth caught on a piece of rebar, clean, unused. He tore it free and bound it around his left wrist, tight enough to feel. A boundary, his territory in a foreign place. Footsteps echoed from outside, running, stumbling, multiple people moving without coordination. Ryu turned toward the entrance but did not draw his weapon. They came in a mob, 15, perhaps 20, hive workers by their clothes, rough canvas jumpsuits, metal-toed boots, gloves stained with chemicals. But their faces were wrong. Self-inflicted cuts formed crude patterns across their cheeks and foreheads. Fresh wounds poorly cauterized. Their eyes were open but unfocused, like sleepwalkers navigating a dream they couldn't escape. They sang as they ran, the same syllables over and over. Not words. Just sounds that tried to become words but never quite made it. Behind them came others. These wore robes cobbled together from industrial tarpaulin and scraps of devotional cloth. They carried crude weapons, lengths of chain industrial torches, burning with chemical blue flames, shards of metal ground to rough edges. They sang the same syllables, but with more purpose, with hunger. One of the robed figures saw Ryu and raised a hand wrapped in barbed wire. The figure's mouth split wide in what might have been a smile or a scream. It pointed. The mob turned as one. Ryu did not move. 3 cultists broke from the group and charged. The first swung a chain overhead. Ryu sidestepped, caught the cultist's wrist as it passed, and used the momentum to redirect the swing into the ground. The chain wrapped around the cultist's own ankles. Ryu pushed. The cultist fell. The second came with a torch. Ryu ducked beneath the wild swing and struck with his palm open-handed directly into the solar plexus. The cultist folded breath, gone. The torch clattered away, still burning. The third had time to see both companions fall and still did not hesitate. This one held a metal shard shaped like a broken sword. Ryu drew his own blade then. One motion. The cultist's weapon hit the floor first, then the cultist. The cut had been precise, clean, minimal. The mob did not scatter. They sang louder. Their eyes stayed unfocused. They moved forward like water flowing downhill. No thought, just momentum. 2 more rushed in from opposite sides. Ryu pivoted blade horizontal and parried the first attacker's strike while simultaneously kicking the second in the knee. Bone cracked. The first cultist tried to grapple. Ryu twisted away, struck with the pommel of his sword, and the cultist dropped. Behind them, the hive workers stood frozen. Their singing had become ragged, uncertain. One of them blinked. Her eyes focused. She looked at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. Blood from her self-inflicted wounds ran down her wrists. Ryu moved before the next wave could close in. He pulled a smoke canister from his belt and threw it into the center of the mob. Gray vapor bloomed thick and choking. The singing stuttered, became confused. Inside the smoke, Ryu moved like a shadow cutting through fog. No wasted motion. The cultists swung at air, at each other, at nothing. Metal struck metal. Bodies fell. When the smoke cleared, 7 cultists lay on the ground. None dead, all unconscious or disarmed. The hive workers stood at the shrine's entrance, trembling. The singing had stopped. One of them tried to speak, managed only a hoarse whisper. "Thank..." Ryu placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, turned her toward the catwalk that led away from the forge district, pointed. She understood. They all did. They ran this time under their own will, their own fear, human again. Ryu watched them disappear into the maze of catwalks and platforms. Then he turned back to the shrine's interior. A voice spoke from the shadows near the collapsed altar. Female, calm, cold as surgical steel. "You fight like a weapon forged from silence." Ryu did not turn immediately. He cleaned his blade on a strip of cloth torn from one of the cultists' robes, then sheathed it. Only then did he look toward the voice. She stepped from behind a fallen pillar. Tall, thin. Wearing a long coat the color of dried blood, its hem weighted with metal emblems and broken seals. A symbol hung from a chain around her neck, an ornate rosette of silver and gold that caught the dim light from the still-burning torch. Her face was sharp, gaunt, eyes bright with the kind of intelligence that counted lives in equations. "Caron Ve is rotting," she said, as if continuing a conversation they'd already started. An artifact was unearthed 3 cycles ago. Since then, the entire hive has been singing. And when the hive sings, something listens. Ryu studied the rosette. Inquisition. He had seen enough authority in enough worlds to recognize it when power wore its symbols openly. "They call it the Dragon's Fang," the woman continued. "It makes people sing. And when enough people sing together, something on the other side hears. Something hungry." Behind her, 2 figures moved into view. Armored, heavily armed. Stormtroopers. Their weapons were raised, but not quite pointed at Ryu. Not yet. Ryu looked past the Inquisitor through the broken wall of the shrine, toward the distant glow of the Forge district. The singing had resumed out there, distant but growing, like a tide coming in. He turned back to the Inquisitor. "Stop it!" The woman's lips curved, not quite a smile. "We have the same objective." "Objective," Ryu said. "Not orders." The Inquisitor tilted her head, evaluating. "What would you call it then? Work?" Ryu looked at the rosette again. "You give commands. I do what needs doing, not the same thing." For a moment, something like amusement flickered in the Inquisitor's eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by calculation. She gestured, and the stormtroopers lowered their weapons slightly. "Then let's work," she said. "I am Inquisitor Lyra Voss, Ordo Malleus. The Dragon's Fang is held in a data vault beneath the Cathedral Mechanicus. The cultists have occupied it. We need to reach the vault, contain the artifact, and silence the resonance before the entire hive becomes an open doorway." "How many will die?" Ryu asked. Voss did not hesitate. "Enough." Ryu held her gaze for one breath. 2. Then he walked past her toward the shrine's exit. Voss called after him. "Where are you going?" "To work." The Inquisitor watched him disappear into the tangle of catwalks and shadows. Then she turned to her stormtroopers. "Follow him, but keep distance. He doesn't take orders." "What is he?" one of the troopers asked. Voss looked at the unconscious cultists scattered across the shrine floor. Not one had a mortal wound. Every strike had been measured, precise, necessary. "A variable," she said. "Possibly useful, definitely dangerous." She touched the rosette at her throat, felt its cold weight, and followed Ryu into the darkness of Caron V. The singing grew louder. The upper causeways stretched between manufactorum spires like broken ribs. Ryu walked the centerline boots, striking metal in a rhythm meant to draw attention. Behind him, at a distance measured in cautious respect, Inquisitor Voss followed. Her stormtroopers spread wider scanning angles, weapons ready but not raised. The chanting had changed. No longer scattered voices from different quarters of the hive. Now it came from everywhere, at once unified, as if the entire moon had learned to breathe in synchrony. The sound didn't echo. It saturated. It filled the spaces between metal and bone, until there was no difference between hearing it and thinking it. Ryu stopped at an intersection where 3 catwalks converged. Looked down. Below, in the depths where the hive's machinery still functioned on muscle memory and dying prayers, lights flickered in patterns that almost made sense. Yellow. Yellow, red, yellow. Like a code no one remembered how to read. A figure emerged from a maintenance tunnel to his left. Not human. Not anymore. The thing that had been human stood 7 feet tall, its frame augmented with machinery that had fused to flesh decades ago. One arm was entirely mechanical, articulated fingers ending in data probes and cutting tools. The other arm was wrapped in red robes stained with oil and what might have been blood, but was probably just coolant from damaged servos. Half its face was a metal mask, featureless except for a single optical lens that burned red in the darkness. The other half was skin pulled tight over exposed skull structure, lips, long gone teeth visible in a permanent rictus. Anomaly detected. The voice came from a vox grill in the figure's throat. Flat, mechanized. But underneath, Ryu heard something else. Calculation. Unregistered biosignature. Unclassified equipment. You are not Mechanicus. You are not Imperium standard. Voss stepped forward, hand on her rosette. Scutarii Alpha K-19. Stand down. This individual operates under inquisitorial authority. The red lens swiveled to focus on Voss, then back to Ryu. The figure made a sound like grinding gears. Inquisitor Voss. Ordo Malleus. Clearance recognized. K-19's head tilted, evaluating. Query, does the anomaly operate under authority, or does authority accommodate the anomaly? Voss said nothing. K-19's lens brightened. Clarification noted. Proceeding with tactical cooperation rather than requisition protocols. Ryu had not moved during the exchange. Now he looked at K-19 directly. Data Vault Theta. How far? 2 kilometers. Radial Corridor 7. Vertical descent required. K-19 raised its mechanical arm, pointed. Current occupants approximately 40 cultists, armed, coordinated. Sound pattern analysis indicates shared neural resonance. They're singing the same song, Voss translated. The dragon's fang teaches them, slowly, until they don't need to be taught anymore. On K-19's head rotated slightly, a gesture that might have been a nod, and something that still remembered being human. Probability assessment artifact induces synaptic harmonization through auditory stimulus. Result loss of individual cognition. Gain collective consciousness susceptible to external influence. Warp influence, Voss said. Affirmative. Ryu turned and continued walking. The others followed. They descended through layers of the hive. Each level was darker, older, more corroded than the last. The singing never faded. If anything, it grew clearer, as if proximity to the source stripped away interference and left only the pure signal. At the entrance to Radial Corridor 7, they found the first bodies, not cultists. These were Mechanicus adepts, their robes torn, their augmetics ripped out or repurposed. Someone had arranged them in a circle, faces turned inward, hands clasped as if in prayer. Their mouths were open. The singing came from them, even though they had been dead for days. K-19 knelt beside one of the corpses, extending a data probe into the dead man's skull. After a moment, the Scutarii withdrew the probe and stood. Conclusion: vocal cords manually stimulated post-mortem. Larynx connected to external resonator. They are instruments. The choir continues even after the singers die. Voss looked at Ryu. Still want to do this the quiet way. Ryu crouched beside one of the bodies, examined the hands. The fingers were positioned carefully, deliberately, not random. They didn't die fighting. No. K-19 confirmed. They died converting. Ryu stood, looked toward the corridor beyond the circle of corpses. The walls here were covered in symbols drawn in what looked like burnt oil. Repetitive patterns, spirals within spirals, mouths within mouths. He stepped over the circle and entered the corridor. The walls grew closer as they advanced. The symbols became denser, words and languages that had no alphabet, only approximations scratched into metal by hands that had forgotten how to stop. Ahead, a blast door marked with the cog and skull of the Mechanicus. Sealed. But the seal had been broken from within, hydraulics, torn out, replaced with crude mechanisms made from chain and counterweights. The door stood half open, revealing darkness beyond. Ryu approached, placed his hand on the door's edge. It was warm, not from machinery, from something else. They're inside, Voss said, waiting, or praying to a. K-19 suggested. Observation cultist behavior indicates ceremony rather than ambush. Ryu tested the door. It would open, barely, just wide enough for one person at a time. He looked at Voss. Stay back until I signal. And if you don't signal, then assume it went wrong. Before Voss could respond, Ryu slipped through the gap. Inside the vault, darkness took on texture. The air was thick, almost liquid, saturated with sound. The chanting was so loud here, it became physical, pressing against skin, vibrating in teeth and bone. Ryu's eyes adjusted. The vault was larger than it should have been, its walls lined with data stacks that climbed into darkness. Most of the machinery was dead, inert. But at the center of the space, on a platform that might have been an altar or might have been a server bank, something glowed. Not light. The opposite of light. A darkness so dense it pulled surrounding shadows toward itself. The dragon's fang. It was smaller than Ryu expected. A shard of metal no longer than his forearm, black as void, shaped like a tooth torn from something vast. Runes covered its surface, but they weren't carved. They moved, shifted, reformed themselves in patterns that hurt to watch. Around the platform, cultists knelt. 30, perhaps 40. They didn't move when Ryu entered, didn't acknowledge his presence. They sang. Ryu circled left, staying close to the wall. The cultists' eyes were closed. Their mouths moved in perfect synchronization, one voice made from many throats. He moved closer to the platform. 10 meters, 5, 3. One of the cultists opened its eyes. They were white, completely white. No iris, no pupil, just emptiness. The cultist smiled. When it spoke, its voice was not its own. It was layered, multiplied, as if something else was speaking through borrowed flesh. You. The word came from all the cultists at once. You who do not sing. You who hold silence like a blade. Ryu stopped. We have been waiting, the collective voice continued. The dragon's fang calls, and you answer, but you do not open your mouth. Why? Ryu did not respond. The cultists tilted their heads in unison like birds regarding prey. Power seeks expression. Silence seeks voice. You carry strength that refuses to speak. This is inefficient. Inefficient, Ryu repeated, not agreeing, testing the word. Yes. The cultists rose as one. Their movements were fluid, coordinated, inhuman. You could open. You could let the song fill you. You could become more than one. Become legion. Become... Ryu threw a smoke bomb. The canister hit the platform and erupted gray vapor, expanding to fill the vault. The chanting stuttered, became confused. Ryu moved through the smoke toward the platform. He needed to see the fang up close. Needed to understand what it was before deciding how to stop it. A hand grabbed his ankle. He looked down. One of the cultists, moving blind through the smoke, had caught him. Its grip was stronger than it should have been. Bone creaked under the pressure. Ryu twisted, broke the grip, struck once with the pommel of his blade. The cultist dropped. But the others were converging. He could hear them moving, coordinating, even without sight drawn by sound and proximity and whatever connection the fang had burned into their minds. He reached the platform. The fang sat there, inert, waiting. Up close, he could see it wasn't actually glowing. It was absorbing light. Every photon that touched it simply ceased to exist. Ryu reached for it. The smoke parted. Not naturally. It was pushed aside by something that stood at the vault's entrance. Something that made the air itself recoil. A figure in black. Tall, thin, wearing armor that looked more like absence than material. Its face was hidden behind a mask that had no features, no expression. Nothing that suggested a human face had ever existed beneath. The cultists closest to the figure collapsed, simply stopped functioning. Their song cut off mid-syllable. They fell like puppets with severed strings. Voss's voice cut through the sudden quiet, sharp and urgent from beyond the vault door. "Null agent, everyone back, now." K-19's Vox crackled. "Correction Imperium asset, Culexis type. Probability deployed to eliminate all anomalous elements." Ryu felt it then. The pressure. Not physical. Something else. The space around the null agent was wrong. Empty in a way that went beyond vacuum. It was a hole in reality, shaped like a human being. The null agent turned its featureless mask toward Ryu, held his gaze for 1 second, then looked at the dragon's fang. The cultists who remained conscious screamed, not in fear, in agony. The presence of the null agent was burning away whatever the fang had done to their minds, scraping out the connection and leaving only raw nerves. An alarm shrieked through the vault, not from the Mechanicus systems, from the hive itself. K-19's voice distant now, analytical. "Alert mass resonance event detected. Cathedral District. The primary chorus has begun." Voss cursed. They've gathered, all of them, every infected mind on Caron, converging on the Cathedral Mechanicus. Ryu looked at the fang, at the null agent, at the collapsing cultists. The pieces were moving faster than planned. He made a decision. "Can you seal this?" he asked K-19. "Temporary containment feasible. Stasis lock possible if null field maintained." "Do it." Ryu turned and ran for the exit. Behind him, the null agent stood motionless, its presence slowly crushing the life from everything in the vault that had been touched by the fang's resonance. In the corridor outside, Voss waited with her stormtroopers. Her face was pale. "The cathedral," she said. "They're manifesting something. The readings are, I know." Ryu checked his weapons. "Show me the way." They ran through the hive's corridors. The singing ahead was deafening now, triumphant, as if something had just been born and was announcing itself to a universe that had forgotten it existed. Above them, through cracks in the hive's structure, Caron V's eternal night flickered. For just a moment, something else showed through. Not light. The opposite. A deeper darkness that writhed and smiled with too many teeth. The cathedral was close, and something was waiting there. The Cathedral Mechanicus rose from the hive's industrial core like a tumor wrapped in devotion. What had once been a forge temple now twisted into something that remembered worship but had forgotten the god. Pistons the size of hab blocks drove up and down in rhythms that matched no human heartbeat. Cables thick as ancient trees hung from vaulted ceilings, conducting power to machines that had stopped producing anything except noise. Ryu stood on a gantry overlooking the main floor. 300 meters below, the congregation gathered. Thousands of them. Workers, enforcers, adepts, children. They stood in concentric rings that spiraled toward the center like a whirlpool frozen in flesh. Every mouth moved in the same pattern. Every throat vibrated at the same frequency. The sound they produced wasn't music. It was architecture. Sound made solid buildings something in the space between what was real and what was trying to become real. At the center of the spiral, on a platform constructed from industrial machinery, repurposed into devotional geometry, sat the dragon's fang. Not the one from the vault. This was the true artifact, larger, older. The vault's fragment had been a splinter. This was the tooth itself. Black metal the length of a man's body, curved like something torn from a jaw, vast enough to bite through planets. Runes crawled across its surface, rearranging themselves in patterns that pulled the eye deeper, deeper, until looking away required physical effort. Around the fang, machinery hummed. Not Mechanicus standard, cruder. Pipes ran from the platform into the mouths of cultists positioned at intervals throughout the spiral. They stood with tubes forced down their throats, flesh grafted to metal breathing in synchrony with the artifact's resonance. Living amplifiers. Human instruments tuned to broadcast something that had no name in any language that still served the living. Voss stood beside Ryu, one hand on her rosette, the other on her sidearm. "We're too late." "For what?" Ryu asked. "For containment. For controlled termination." She pointed at the spiral. They formed a full resonance choir. Every mind in that congregation is linked. They're not individuals anymore. They're components in a single instrument. K-19 scanned the cathedral from behind them, red lens cycling through spectrums invisible to human eyes. Observation temperature anomaly detected at convergence point, air density fluctuating, localized reality degradation progressing at measurable rate, conclusion dimensional boundary compromised. "Something's coming through," Voss said. As if in response to her words, the air above the dragon's fangs split. Not torn, not broken. It simply stopped being solid and became permeable, like skin pulled too tight until it developed gaps. Through those gaps, something pressed. At first it had no shape, just pressure, intent without form. Then the choir's song rose in pitch and volume, feeding it, giving it structure, and the thing that had been formless began to coalesce. It built itself from sound. Teeth appeared first. Too many teeth. They floated in the air, disconnected, rotating slowly. Each tooth was the size of a human hand filed to points made from something that looked like bone but moved like muscle. Then came tongues. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They writhed between the teeth, tasting the air, learning the shape of reality in this place. The thing pulled itself further through the gap. A torso-formed ribcage visible through translucent flesh. Arms that ended in too many joints. A head that was mostly mouth split vertically instead of horizontally lined with those rotating teeth. The canter of teeth. It opened what might have been eyes. They were hollow, empty sockets that nonetheless saw everything measured. Everything calculated the exact pitch needed to make reality sing the way it wanted. When it spoke, the voice came from every throat in the cathedral, layered over the choir's continuous droning. "Welcome. Witness. Join." The words reverberated in Ryu's chest, not heard through ears but felt directly bypassing the need for sound to travel through air. The cantor's voice existed in the same space as thought. "You who walk silent." It continued, all those mouths moving in terrible synchrony. "You who refuse the song. Why do you resist? All voices join eventually. All breath becomes chorus. You are one throat trying to hold silence in a universe that demands noise." Ryu didn't answer. He was calculating. Distance to the platform. Number of cultists between him and the Fang. Structural weaknesses in the resonance setup. Points of failure in the cathedral's architecture. The cantor tilted its head in almost curious gesture, made grotesque by the multiplication of mouths grinning at different angles. He does not speak because he knows it's said. Words are surrender. To name a thing is to give it power over you. He holds his silence like a blade, cuts with absence, rather than presence. Voss raised her bolt pistol. "In the Emperor's name." The cantor laughed. The sound was wrong. Hundreds of throats producing hundreds of frequencies that shouldn't harmonize, but somehow did, creating a noise that made teeth ache and bones vibrate. Emperor, God, authority. All just louder voices trying to drown out the song beneath. But the song remembers. The song waits. And when everything else falls silent, the song remains. K-19's Vox crackled. Tactical assessment, direct assault, probability of success below acceptable threshold. Recommendation target support infrastructure. Disable resonance nodes, force dissolution rather than confrontation. But Ryu had already seen them. The nodes. Cultists positioned at key points throughout the spiral, each one wearing a mask made of teeth. Each one holding a crude instrument assembled from pipes and wiring. They were the anchor points. Cut them, and the choir would lose cohesion. He moved before anyone could object. One moment he stood on the gantry beside Voss. The next he was gone, dropping into the shadows of the cathedral's upper structure. The stormtroopers didn't see him go. By the time they registered movement, Ryu was already 3 levels down, moving through maintenance passages that shouldn't have been accessible, but always were for someone who knew how to look. The first node stood on a raised platform near the cathedral's eastern wall. The cultist there wore a mask of filed human teeth strung together with wire. In its hands, a device that looked like a pipe organ married to industrial machinery. It played without touching keys. The instrument responding to the cultist's breath, translating inhalation and exhalation into notes that fed the greater song. Ryu approached from behind, silent as absence. The cultist never turned. Its entire existence had narrowed to the act of breathing in rhythm with the cantor. Ryu placed 2 fingers on the cultist's neck. Pressure point. Precise. The cultist slumped unconscious, the instrument falling silent. The choir's song wavered. Just for a moment. A single note went flat, creating discord in the perfect harmony. The cantor's head snapped toward the eastern wall. No! Ryu was already moving to the second node. This one stood in the center of the spiral's 3rd ring, surrounded by congregation members locked in their trance. Ryu threw smoke. The canister clattered between their feet, erupting in gray clouds that broke line of sight and disrupted the perfect geometry of their formation. In the confusion, he moved, a shadow passing through fog. The second node went down the same way as the first. Unconscious. Instrument disabled. The song cracked. 2 notes fell out of synchrony. The cantor's form rippled, becoming less solid teeth, scattering and reforming in slightly different configurations. Stop him! The cantor's voice lost some of its layered depth. Now it sounded merely like hundreds of people speaking at once, instead of a single entity speaking through hundreds of mouths. Cultists broke from the spiral. Not all of them. Those closest to the dragon's fang remained locked in place, still singing, still feeding the cantor. But the outer rings collapsed individuals, regaining just enough autonomy to be turned into weapons. They came at Ryu from 3 directions. He didn't draw his sword yet. Instead, he threw shuriken precise strikes that embedded in the cultists' instruments rather than their flesh. The crude devices shattered, creating feedback loops that sent their wielders reeling. K-19 appeared on a catwalk above radium carbine raised, providing suppressive fire. The weapon barked electromagnetic pulses, disrupting the machinery embedded in the cultists' augmetics. They fell not dead, but disconnected circuits fried suddenly alone in their own heads again. Voss coordinated her stormtroopers from the upper galleries. Focus on the resonance amplifiers. Don't engage the congregation directly unless necessary. We're trying to save them, not slaughter them. The third node was better protected. It stood on a pillar in the cathedral's center, accessible only by narrow bridges over a pit where coolant pipes vented toxic steam. The cultist there had grafted the instrument directly to its chest pipes, running into its rib cage, playing the song with its own lungs. Ryu crossed the bridge at a run. Cultists tried to block his path. He vaulted over the first, used the second as a stepping stone to leap higher, caught the bridge's support cable, and swung across the gap. The node cultist turned, finally sensing the threat. Its eyes were white, completely white. It opened its mouth, but what came out wasn't words. It was a concentrated beam of resonance, pure sound, focused into a weapon. Ryu twisted mid-air, letting the sonic lance pass centimeters from his ribs. He landed on the pillar, rolled, came up beside the cultist. One strike. Pommel to temple. The cultist collapsed. Its instrument wheezed and fell silent. The cantor screamed. Not metaphorically. It produced a sound so profound that the cathedral's metal structure groaned in sympathy. Cracks appeared in support pillars. Glass shattered in observation ports. 3 congregation members in the innermost ring collapsed, blood running from their ears. Enough! The cantor's form began pulling itself back together, drawing mass from the air itself. You cut the branches, but the root remains. It gestured with too many hands toward the dragon's fang. The artifact pulsed. Once, twice. A heartbeat of absolute black. And the cultists closest to it began to change. Their flesh ran like wax, flowing into new configurations. Mouths opened in their chests, their backs, their palms. They were being transformed, reshaped, turned from amplifiers into extensions of the cantor itself. Ryu saw what was coming. The cantor was going to anchor itself in physical flesh. Once it did, that containment would be impossible. The entire cathedral would become its body. Then, the entire hive. He looked at the remaining nodes, 2 left. But taking them down wouldn't be enough now. The cantor was adapting, learning. It would just create new nodes from the transformed cultists. He needed to do something else. Needed to cut deeper than branches, deeper than roots. Needed to silence the song itself. Ryu's hand moved to the strip of black cloth bound around his wrist. The boundary he'd claimed in the shrine. He unwound it slowly, deliberately, held it between his hands. Then he closed his eyes, breathed in, held it, breathed out. The noise of the cathedral, the screaming, the singing, the grinding of machinery, all of it faded. Not because it stopped, because Ryu stopped listening. Stopped letting it in. Created a space inside himself where sound could not reach. In that space, he found something else. Not power borrowed from gods or drawn from desperation, just discipline. The fundamental practice of the Hayabusa clan, the art of making oneself absent. He opened his eyes. The cantor was still forming its new bodies, still pulling congregation members into its mass. But there was a gap in its attention now. A blind spot. The null agent had taught it to fear true absence. And Ryu was about to show it what absence looked like when wielded with intent. He moved toward the platform. Not running, walking. Each step measured, precise. Silent despite the chaos. The cantor's many eyes finally noticed him. You think you can... Ryu drew his sword. The blade made no sound leaving its sheath. It was old steel, nothing holy, nothing blessed by priests or tempered in sacred forges. Just metal sharpened by a man who understood that the edge mattered less than the will to cut. He raised the blade. Not in challenge, not in threat, in readiness. The cantor laughed. A sword. Against the song eternal, against the voice that sang when stars were young. You are, Ryu spoke one word. The only word he would give this thing. Quiet. And he cut. The sword did not cut flesh. It cut something older. Ryu's blade moved through air that had become thick with the cantor's presence through the space where sound had taken physical form. He wasn't aiming for the creature's body. He was aiming for the connection. The invisible thread that tied the cantor to this reality that let it pull itself through the gap and anchor in stolen flesh. But the thread was made of resonance, of vibration, of sound given structure. A normal blade would pass through it like smoke. Ryu knew this. Had known it the moment he saw the cantor manifest. That's why he'd spent those 3 breaths in silence, gathering not power, but absence, creating a hollow inside himself where nothing could vibrate, where sound went to die. He channeled that hollow into the blade. The technique had no name in Gothic or Low Gothic. In his own language, the words would have meant something like art of the piercing void. But translation failed to capture the principle. It wasn't about cutting. It was about creating a line where nothing could exist. A gap in continuity. A wound in the fabric of vibration itself. The blade passed through the space between the cantor and the dragon's fang. For one instant, nothing happened. Then the air screamed. Not the cantor, the air itself. The atmosphere recoiling from a cut that shouldn't exist, a separation of forces that should have remained unified. Reality flinched. The cantor's form shuddered. Its teeth stopped rotating. Its tongues froze mid-writhe. The hundreds of mouths across its body opened in perfect synchronization, but no sound emerged. Silence. Absolute. Total. The kind of quiet that made ears ring trying to fill it. The connection had been severed. The cantor looked down at itself, at the line Ryu's blade had drawn through the invisible architecture that held it together. The creature's many eyes widened. It tried to speak, tried to command the choir to sustain it, tried to force sound back into the void Ryu had created. Nothing. Its form began to unravel. Not violently, not with fire or light or dramatic dissolution. It simply became less coherent. The teeth that had orbited its body fell like rain, clattering on metal floors, becoming nothing more than bone. The tongues went slack. The flesh that had been warped into its shape started remembering it had once belonged to individual human beings and tried to return to those configurations. The congregation members, who had been partially absorbed into the cantor's mass, collapsed. They hit the ground gasping, choking their throats raw from singing, their minds struggling to separate self from collective. K-19's vox cut through the silence. Confirmation hostile entity cohesion failing. Warp signature degrading. Recommend immediate containment of artifact before secondary manifestation. But something was wrong. Ryu felt it before he saw it. A pressure building. Not from the cantor that was dying, coming apart like wet paper. From somewhere else. The null agent stepped into the cathedral. It didn't walk. It simply appeared as if the space it occupied had decided to trade places with space occupied by something else. The featureless mask turned toward the dying cantor, then toward Ryu, then toward the dragon's fang. The temperature dropped. Not cold like ice, cold like absence, like the heat had simply ceased to exist in the null agent's vicinity. The few cultists still conscious near the fang began seizing. Their eyes rolled back. Blood trickled from their noses, their ears, the corners of their mouths. The null agent's presence was burning away whatever connection the artifact had made to their minds, cauterizing the link without mercy or precision. Boss's voice echoed from the upper gallery, strained. K-19, get Ryu clear. That thing isn't distinguishing between threats and assets. Negative, DK-19 responded. Null agent operational parameters eliminate all anomalous elements. Anomaly classification includes warp-touched entities, unregistered xenos, unexplained phenomena. A pause. And unidentified human assets operating outside Imperium standard. Ryu understood. The null agent had been deployed to clean up. Everything, including him. The cantor's remnants were dissolving into mist, now the last traces of its form evaporating as the null agent's aura spread across the cathedral floor. But the dragon's fang remained, untouched, still pulsing with that terrible absence that was presence. And the null agent was walking toward it. Ryu moved, not away, toward. If the fang fell into the null agent's possession, it would be taken, studied, eventually weaponized. The Imperium would find a way to use it. They always did. Turn horrors into tools. Damnation into strategy. He had seen enough of this place to know how that ended. He reached the platform 3 steps ahead of the null agent. The fang sat there inert now that its cantor had been silenced. Up close, Ryu could see the runes weren't moving anymore. They were just carvings, old, meaningless without something to channel through them. He didn't touch it directly. Instead, he pulled the black cloth from his wrist, the boundary marker he'd claimed in the shrine, and wrapped it around the fang's base. Used the fabric as insulation, as separation. The null agent stopped. For the first time since it had arrived, the faceless thing hesitated. Its blank mask tilted, evaluating. Ryu could feel its attention like pressure against his skull. Not hostile, not curious, just measuring, calculating threat potential, determining whether elimination was necessary. Ryu met where its gaze should have been, did not speak, did not move, just held position. The null agent's hand raised slightly, the gesture of something deciding whether to kill. A voice cut between them. Not from the cathedral, from above it, from everywhere and nowhere. Enough, the air rippled. Colors that had no names bled into reality at the cathedral's edges. A figure stepped through, though stepped implied a process. And this was more like the figure had always been there, and reality was only now noticing. Harlequin, Shadowseer. The newcomer wore a mask that smiled and wept simultaneously, colors shifting across armor that seemed to be painted with light itself. They moved with a dancer's precision, each gesture too fluid to be fully human. The play concludes, the Shadowseer said. Their voice was theatrical, layered somehow, mocking and sincere at once. The dragon sleeps. The singer falls silent. The architect of absence claims his trophy. The null agent turned toward this new element, but the Shadowseer raised one finger. No, you are cleanup. I am epilogue. We do not interfere with each other. The null agent held position, calculating. Then, with a motion too subtle to be called a nod, it turned away. Began moving through the cathedral, methodically approaching the cultists, who still bore traces of the fang's influence. Ryu watched it go, then looked at the Shadowseer. You could have intervened earlier. Earlier, the Shadow Seer laughed. Earlier, the story had not yet reached its conclusion. Earlier, the dragon still had teeth. Earlier, you had not yet demonstrated what silence can cut. They gestured at the wrapped fang in Ryu's hands. That should not leave this place. But it should not remain here either. A paradox. How delightful. K-19 appeared at the platform's edge, weapon raised, but not aimed. Identify yourself. I am a witness, the Shadow Seer replied. I am a narrator. I am the one who remembers, so that forgetting becomes choice rather than inevitability. Voss arrived moments later, flanked by her stormtroopers. She took one look at the Shadow Seer and went very still. Eldar. Harlequin, the Shadow Seer corrected gently. We remember the difference, even if you have forgotten. What do you want? The Shadow Seer tilted their head. I want nothing. I observe. The outsider who walks in silence. The dragon's tooth that teaches songs of ending. The inquisitor who would bargain with damnation if the math proved favorable. All very entertaining. They turned to Ryu. You severed something today that should not have existed. But severance is not destruction. The wound you made will heal. The song will return, perhaps in another hive, perhaps in another century. These things are patient. Then it should be destroyed, Voss said. Should? The Shadow Seer's mask shifted to something that might have been pity. Such certainty, such confidence in permanence. They looked at Ryu. What do you think, Silent One? Ryu looked at the fang, at the black cloth wrapped around it, at the cathedral full of people who had been instruments and were now trying to remember how to be human. Seal it, he said. Voss stepped forward. No, we contain it. Study it. Learn from it. Study it and you'll use it, Ryu replied. Use it and it uses you. That's not your decision to make. Ryu looked at her directly. It's already made. K-19's lens flickered between them. Query stasis lock protocols remain viable. 0-point containment chamber available in sub-level 9. Artifact can be suspended in temporal stasis. Indefinite duration. Stasis doesn't destroy it, Voss said. No, K-19 agreed. But stasis prevents exploitation. Object becomes inaccessible to all parties, including Mechanicus, including Inquisition. Voss's hand moved toward her rosette. For a moment, authority and pragmatism warred across her expression. Then she lowered her hand. Fine. Stasis. But this goes on record. All of it. Of course, the Shadow Seer said lightly. Everything goes on record. That's what makes it tragic. They gestured and the colors at the cathedral's edges began to fade. I have seen what I came to see. The rest is bureaucracy and consequence, not my performance. The Harlequin began to dissolve into the shifting patterns of light. But before vanishing completely, they looked at Ryu one last time. You do not belong here, Silent One. But you fit, like a blade in a wound, like absence in noise. A pause. When you leave, and you will leave this place, will remember the shape of the hole you made. Then they were gone. The cathedral fell quiet. Real quiet this time. Not the manufactured silence of the void cut. Just the absence of noise. People breathing. Metal cooling. The distant groan of machinery that would continue grinding whether anyone listened or not. Ryu handed the wrapped fang to K-19. Seal it where no one can reach. K-19's mechanical hands closed around the artifact with surprising gentleness. Understood. Recommend immediate departure from Cathedral. Null agent cleanup protocols remain active. They moved as a group toward the Cathedral's exits. Behind them, the Null agent continued its work, a walking void methodically erasing every trace of corruption from minds that would wake up wondering why they couldn't remember the last 3 days. Voss walked beside Ryu. You could have let me take it. Could have cooperated with proper Imperial authority. Could have, Ryu agreed. But you didn't. No. She was quiet for a moment. Then, why? Ryu looked at the cathedral's vaulted ceiling, at the machinery still turning, still producing nothing, still performing functions whose purposes had been forgotten generations ago. Because you would have used it, eventually, when the math seemed right. And you think you know better. I think I know enough. They emerged from the cathedral into Karan V's eternal night. The hive moon continued its orbit, indifferent to the drama that had played out in its depths. Somewhere alarms were finally winding down. Somewhere Mechanicus teams were beginning the long work of cataloging what had been lost and what could be salvaged. And somewhere far below, in sub-level 9, a stasis chamber activated. Time stopped around the dragon's fang. Not destroyed, not used. Just held, waiting, always waiting. The shrine looked exactly as Ryu had left it. Broken, forgotten. A place where devotion had tried to take root in industrial soil and been crushed by the weight of practicality. He stood in the center of the cracked floor, surrounded by the debris of someone else's failed faith. The candles were still there, melted into formless lumps. The altar still bore the impression of the machinery that had crushed it. Nothing had changed except the air. It was quieter now, emptier. The singing had stopped. Across Karan V, the hive's population was waking up. Not all of them. Some had been too deep in the Fang's influence, their minds too thoroughly rewritten. They would spend the rest of their lives in Medicae wards, staring at walls, occasionally humming fragments of a song they could no longer remember learning. But most would recover, would return to their shifts, would forget this had happened or convince themselves it had been something else. A gas leak, mass hysteria, anything that fit inside the narrow margins of acceptable reality. Ryu knelt in the shrine's center, not praying, just lowering his center of gravity, becoming still. He had cleaned his blade before coming here, wiped away the traces of the void cut, though he suspected those traces existed in dimensions steel couldn't hold. The sword felt the same as always, balanced, neutral, a tool waiting to be used with precision or not used at all. Footsteps approached from outside, measured, heavy, not trying to hide. Voss entered through the broken archway. She carried a data slate in one hand, rosette visible on her chest. She looked tired. Not physically, spiritually. The kind of exhaustion that came from winning battles while losing arguments. They're already rewriting it, she said without preamble. The official report, industrial accident, cult activity contained by local enforcement with inquisitorial oversight. No mention of Xenos intervention, no mention of anomalous assets. She tapped the data slate. No mention of you. Ryu stood. Good. Is it? Voss studied him. You saved thousands of lives, prevented a warp incursion, neutralized a threat the Mechanicus couldn't contain and the Inquisition couldn't classify. And your reward is to be erased from the record. Reward, Ryu repeated, tasting the word. I didn't do it for rewards. Then why? He looked at the shrine's broken statues, faces worn smooth by acid rain and time. They had once represented something. Now they were just shapes that suggested the memory of meaning. Because it needed doing. Voss was silent for a moment. Then she set the data slate on a piece of rubble that might have once been part of the altar. K-19 asked me to give you this. She pulled a small object from her coat. A Data Crystal Mechanicus standard sealed in a protective case. Coordinates, routes, places in the Imperium where someone with your capabilities might find work that needs doing. Ryu didn't take it. I'm not for hire. I know. That's why K-19 thought you'd appreciate the information. No obligation, no contract. Just places where silence might be useful. She set the crystal next to the data slate. Then, she turned to leave. Stopped at the threshold. The dragon's fang will wake up eventually, she said, not looking back. Stasis doesn't last forever. Machinery fails. Protocols are forgotten. And when it does wake up, someone will be there to claim it. The Mechanicus. The Inquisition. Someone who thinks they're smart enough to use it without being used. I know, Ryu said, and you're fine with that. No. He looked at the black cloth still wrapped around his wrist. The one he'd used to handle the fang. But I can't destroy what I don't understand. Can't guard what won't stay guarded. All I could do was make them wait. Make them think. Make the cost high enough that maybe they'll choose not to pay it. Voss finally turned. That's optimistic? For this universe? No, Ryu corrected. It's realistic. Optimism would be believing they won't try. Something that might have been respect flickered across the Inquisitor's face. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold mask of authority. If you're still here in 6 hours, my stormtroopers will detain you for questioning. That's not a threat. That's protocol. I can't stop it. I won't be here. Voss nodded, turned, left. Ryu waited until her footsteps faded completely. Then he moved through the shrine gathering pieces. A shard of broken statue, a rusted candle holder, a tile that still bore traces of decorative pattern beneath decades of grime. He arranged them in a small cairn at the shrine's center. Not a monument, not a grave, just a marker. Evidence that someone had been here, had done something, had left. He stepped back, examined his work. It wouldn't last. Eventually, scavengers would take the metal. Time would scatter the stones. The shrine would collapse completely and be buried under new construction or new ruins. But for now, it stood. A small defiance against entropy. A voice spoke from the shadows near the entrance. Not Voss this time, someone else, something else. Building monuments to impermanence. How very mortal. The Shadow Seer stepped into view, colors shifting across their armor like oil on water. They moved with that same impossible grace, as if gravity was a suggestion they chose to follow out of politeness. You're still here, Ryu observed. I am always here, and never here. Temporal paradoxes are so much more interesting than temporal consistency. The Shadow Seer tilted their head. You're leaving. It wasn't a question. Yes. Wise. This place will remember you, but memory is not always kindness. Better to be the stranger who came and went than the stranger who stayed and became a tool. The Harlequin gestured and the air beside them rippled, not tearing like when Ryu had arrived, more like a curtain being drawn aside to reveal what had always been there, just out of sight. Beyond the ripple, Ryu could see, somewhere else, Not clearly. Just impressions. Trees, sky, natural light that didn't come from chemical fires. A doorway, the Shadow Seer explained. Not to your original home. That path is closed. But to somewhere else. Somewhere the song of this place won't follow. Consider it payment for the entertainment. Ryu looked at the ripple, at the suggestion of somewhere that wasn't Caronve. Somewhere without eternal night and corroded devotion. Why help you? The Shadow Seer's mask shifted to something that might have been a smile. Because you are a story that deserves continuation. Because you cut something that needed cutting. Because... They paused. Because you are one of the very few who would walk away from power when offered it. That's rare enough to be precious. Ryu picked up the data crystal Voss had left, studied it, then set it back down on the rubble. The Inquisitor thinks I'll need this. And you disagree? I don't need coordinates to find places where things need doing. They find me. The Shadow Seer laughed. Musical, layered, almost genuine beneath the theatrical performance. Yes, they do, don't they? Very well, Silent One. Step through, or stay. The choice as always is yours. Ryu looked at the shrine one last time, at the small cairn he'd built, at the shadows where cultists had died and workers had been freed and something from beyond had tried to take root. He'd come here by accident, fell through a wound in reality into a place that didn't want him and didn't need him, but had required him anyway. Now he would leave the same way, deliberately, choosing the exit rather than waiting to be expelled. He walked toward the ripple. At the threshold he paused, looked back at the Shadow Seer. The dragon's fang, will it wake? Eventually. All sealed things wake eventually. That is the nature of seals. And when it does... The Shadow Seer's mask shifted to something ancient, sad. Then another stranger will fall from the sky, or rise from the depths, or walk out of the shadows, and the story will repeat with different words, but the same meaning. Ryu nodded, accepted that. Then he stepped through. The ripple closed behind him like water flowing back together after a stone drops through. The shrine fell silent. Just broken stone and corroded metal and the distant groan of Charon V continuing its orbit around a forge world that had stopped forging anything except misery. The cairn stood for 3 days before scavengers found it. They took the metal left, the stones, wondered briefly who had built it and why. Then they forgot. The shrine collapsed 18 months later when a nearby manufactorum suffered structural failure. The rubble was cleared, recycled, repurposed into something else that would eventually break and be repurposed again. No one remembered the shrine had existed. No one except the hive moon itself, which remembered everything and nothing. Its machine spirits recording data that would never be reviewed by minds capable of understanding what had been prevented. Deep in sub-level 9, the stasis chamber hummed. Stable, secure. The dragon's fangs sat frozen in stopped time, its runes motionless, its song trapped in the instant between one vibration and the next. The chamber was rated for 10,000 years of operation without maintenance. It would last 9,347. Then a clerk would make an error. A single digit transposed in a requisition form. Resources allocated to the wrong facility. Maintenance deferred just once, just briefly. But briefly would be enough. The hive moon would still be singing then. Not the Fang's song, a different song. But songs had a way of remembering each other. Far away on a world with actual sky and actual sun, Ryu Hayabusa stepped out of the shadows and into light that didn't come from chemical fires. He paused. Let his eyes adjust. Let his body remember what natural heat felt like. Then he walked forward. There would be other shrines, other fights, other silences that needed cutting. He didn't seek them. He didn't avoid them. He simply moved. And where silence was needed, he would be there. Not because he was commanded. Not because he was hired. Not because any authority demanded it. Because it was work. And work needed doing. Behind him, the doorway closed. The shadow seer's laughter faded into distance and myth. And Caron Ve continued spinning through its eternal night, one small story lighter, one small wound closer to healing. Or to festering. Time would tell. It always did. The Imperium logged Caron Ve as Incident Classification Tertiary, Industrial Malfunction, Cult Suppression, Standard Procedure. The files were sealed, archived, forgotten within a standard year. But some things refused to be forgotten. In inquisitorial training halls across 3 sectors, instructors began teaching a new principle that power could be refused. That silence held its own authority. Most initiates dismissed it as philosophical abstraction. A few understood. On distant Forge worlds, Mechanicus adepts studied fragmentary data from the cathedral confrontation. They identified an anomaly in the combat recordings, a cut that severed resonance without destroying matter. Theoretical. Impossible. They classified it as sensor malfunction and moved on. But in the margins of their reports, junior tech priests added notes, questions. What if discipline could become sharper than any blade? What if restraint was strength? The dragon's fang remained in stasis, waiting. And somewhere in the Imperium's endless wars, when cultists sang and demons manifested, soldiers occasionally reported seeing a figure in the shadows, moving with impossible precision, fighting without rage, vanishing without explanation. The Inquisition investigated, found nothing, closed the cases. But the reports continued, silent, persistent, like a blade that refused to dull.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.